Hey, well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the class so far, loving the conversations and how you're wrestling with these concepts and questions. And hopefully we're starting to see some patterns emerging as we kind of follow the flow of the missionary spirit throughout history and into this movement called Fresh Expressions. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the biblical theology of pioneer ministry. So we focused on fresh expressions in general, but now we're going to focus on what the language that came out of the United Kingdom around pioneer ministry. Now we need to acknowledge right up front that this language can be problematic for us in the U.S. American context. The language can have connections with colonialism and imperialism and all those things. But there's also another way to think about pioneering. We often use the word pioneer today, right? When we talk about people that are pioneers in some technology or some new approach to, psychology or some new emerging thing in a field of study, right? We call that a person a pioneer. And so the first thing that I want to do is kind of ground the idea of pioneer ministry in the scriptures. And believe it or not, the word pioneer is a biblical word. And so here in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, I'll break this passage down a little bit, but just let me kind of give the overview here. We're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. We're all the saints of the past and present and future. There's this community around us as we lay aside the weight of sin that clings so closely and we run with perseverance the race that's set before us. And so I just get this image of, the crowd of witnesses. We're running the race in Christ to get the crown of victory, right? So this is an athletic image here. We're running that race. The people are on the standby. On the sidelines saying, go, 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 you can run the race. We ran the race, you can run it too, right? So it's this beautiful imagery. But then the part I want to key in today. So looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. And so we see that word pioneer in some of your translations. You're going to literally see the word pioneer, like in the NRSV. And that the Greek word there is archegas. Archegas. And in its base meaning, it's kind of somebody who goes first, a chief, leader, a prince, one that takes the lead in anything, a predecessor in the matter. And so you'll see some translations will translate it as author, and some as pioneer. But the idea here is the trailblazer, the innovator. This is the closest biblical word we get to innovator, archegas. It's a beautiful word. And it's used to describe Jesus. And so let's drill down in this a little bit more. We're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. We're running the race that's set before us. And so one of the things I want to talk about pioneer ministry is one of the false assumptions we can have is this is for like the heroic solo leader, the individual who can blaze the new trail and do the new thing, right? But I want to really understand pioneering in the context of community. And I've written about this quite a lot, that we can't import into it this Western idea of pioneering as being a solo effort or an individual, like there's this whole thing around the founders myth in the West, right? And the heroic individual, the John Wayne, riding out through the sunset or whatever. And that doesn't really work in pioneering. Those of us who are practitioners of pioneer ministry, and many of you who are doing pioneering and innovative ministries in your own context, you know this, right? That we got to do it with a team. It takes a team. And then the next part of this, so notice that it's in the context of community and running this race. And then Jesus is described as our archegas, the pioneer and the perfecter. So he not only blazes the trail of our faith, he completes and fulfills our faith, right? That Jesus, we are totally dependent on that, on him for that. But the idea of pioneer, that think of as we're running that race, what's our target? What's the finish line? What are we doing? Well, the idea is we're looking to Jesus, right? Our gaze is fixed on Jesus. We're running the race, but we're following in the slipstream of Jesus. He's already blazed the trail of new creation. He's already conquered sin and hell and death. He's already been risen victorious in his beautiful, glorious, wound-bearing, death-conquering self, now sitting on the throne of the cosmos, right? So when we think about pioneer ministry, we have to understand that it's always following in the trail of Jesus, that he's the one who's blazed the trail of new creation, and we are following in the slipstream. When people, professional racers or bicyclists, cyclists, or inline skaters, there's this thing called a slipstream where you get behind the person in front of you and you create this wind resistance and you kind of ride in that wind resistance. So when we think about pioneering, I want to ground it in this biblical idea that we're not the trailblazer of new creation, right? We're following the slipstream of Jesus. But as we follow in the wake of Jesus' new creation and Jesus' pioneering gift, if you will, we also get drawn in and participate in the work of new creation and creativity and innovation. And then there's this piece that we like to ignore a lot. I see people talk about this and they kind of cut off verse 2. For the joy who was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, is taking the seat at the right hand of the throne of God. If we follow Jesus in the work of pioneering and new creation and creativity and innovation and the things I want to share about in these next 2 lectures, you can guarantee that you're going to be carrying a cross. There's going to be resistance. There's going to be rebellions. When we talk about pioneering and doing new things and doing ministry in what some will conceive to be new and creative ways, you can bet that you're going to have opposition from that, from inside and from outside. I find it usually it's more from folks inside the church than outside of it, in my experience. But you can guarantee that there's going to be some struggle, there's going to be some tribulation, and some cross carrying in this work. And that's just, I think, the case of, doing anything new and creatively and connecting with people outside the church. There's going to be some cross carrying. But remember that Jesus, as our archegos and our pioneer and trailblazer of our faith, that was the journey that he took, right? So we have to ask ourselves this question: are we going to follow Jesus? Are we going to follow him all the way? I think people want to get the title and do the new creative things and all of that, but are you willing to also if you pay the cost that Jesus paid and to face that kind of opposition and cross carrying? So George Lings is from the Church Army Research Unit in the UK, and so they've done a lot of research on fresh expressions and pioneer ministry and studying pioneers and the traits of pioneers. And so I want to share some of this research from their studies. And pioneers are called those that have the gift of not fitting in, the gift of not fitting in. And I will share in the next lecture about the pioneer gift and how we can make some room for that. But if you ever felt like you don't fit in, like in a more traditional, conventional setting, or and if you've ever had that feeling like I don't quite fit in here with this group, that is a gift. That is what we're saying in pioneer ministry. It's a gift that you don't fit in, and God will use that because God uses the pioneer gift in incredible ways. But so George Lings did all this research around pioneering and found that there's a close relationship between an apostle and a pioneer. The apostle, always taking the next hill, always moving on to the next thing, outwardly focused, right? And creating new paths. So you could think of somebody like Paul the apostle, who's always going to the next community, raising up indigenous leadership, and then moving on to the next church plant, right? But one of the things about pioneers is there's that connection. So they're oriented outward, they're moving, they're cultivating and multiplying usually things. Pioneers typically go first, and so they have a low risk aversion. So when we all come to the cliff and we're looking down and we're thinking, I wonder how far that is down there. The pioneer is the one who just jumps and says, I'll tell you when I get to the bottom. And this is just a typical, like, pioneers just kind of try stuff. They just kind of start. They just kind of have this intuition and this instinct, and they move on that. And they're not as concerned as with traditional paradigms of risk. They have a habitual creator, starter, initiator kind of gift. And so there's a close relationship with entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs. I'll share more about that later. And pioneers. And they even have a different way that they kind of think. And I want to dig into that a little bit more here soon. But pioneers draw followers, and they're followable. So when you think about pioneers, sometimes we have this edgy vision of a pioneer doing stuff way crazy on the edge. Well, I have 15 Fresh Expressions in my church, 15 different pioneers that are usually lay persons that are overseeing these new Christian communities. And so I've got 80-year-old Larry, who's a pioneer. He started his church in a dog park. It's called Paws of Praise. And he got a group of people around him, and he started a church in a dog park because that's what he does. That's his practice. That's his people, right? I've got 30-year-old Denise, who started her running church, Church 3.1. And she's gathered a group of people around her, and she's just doing that in the normal rhythms of her life. I've got, Nicole, who started church in the tattoo parlor with her people and her community of people. So if you can think of just people that you know in your life who could gather a group of friends around them, find a simple way to love them, share Jesus with them over time, kind of grow a community, then they can be involved in this work of pioneering. So they're followers, they draw followers, they're followable. Pioneers leave. They usually have an instinct to like get things started, initiate, build a team, and then move on. And this can be really dizzying to work with. I have some congregations that I've served that could probably testify to this, right? That when I was, I think we mature as pioneers really, and I was always starting stuff, moving to the next thing. But as you mature in that gifting, you learn to build teams, you learn to build relationships that sustain these innovations, and you kind of build that in from the beginning. But you do want to move to the next thing. You feel like something is kind of built up. So again, if you think of Paul the Apostle, he's not hanging out for long periods of time in these churches. He's moving on from place to place. As Moyna did such a great work looking at Paul in his early model of church planning and Church for Every Context, which we read together. Pioneers are movers. They're the opposite of static. They're ready to go. Okay. When most people are sitting around kind of settled and everything's good, the pioneers got to move on to the next thing. And they're typically met by Jesus. And I have found this to be true with lots of pioneers that I've been in a relationship with, that I coach, that I work with, that almost all the pioneers I know have some kind of story that goes like this. I had an encounter with Christ, or somebody prayed for me, and then I had a situation where I was in a worship service and I heard God speak to me, or there's some version of, my life was going this way and it's now going this way. I have met some pioneers that have the traditional, like I grew up in church, went to church, and they just have this innovator gift. So don't hear me saying that. But there is this tendency among pioneers that they've had some kind of supernatural encounter, some kind of their testimony is somehow Jesus broke into my life in this significant way. Pioneers prefer to be with outsiders. This is important, and this is what can be really frustrating for congregations who have pioneer pastors, which I'm assuming is some of you. That pioneers are usually they're the lost sheep chasers. Okay, so they're leaving the 99 to go after the lost one, like Jesus teaches us in Luke 15. They actually prefer that. They're more naturally able to be with people outside the church than in it, and that's the gift of not fitting in that we're talking about. And pioneers are at home with signs and the supernatural. They typically are semioticians, context readers. They embrace the miraculous, the supernatural. So there's this expectation when you're out there on the edge with people who aren't Christian yet, that God's going to show up, God's going to do stuff, that there's still this idea that healing can happen and those things right here where we are today. Pioneers are flexible strategists. They employ an effectual reasoning process. I will come back to that and just unpack that a little bit, what that means. But I love Jesus' forgotten beatitude. Blessed are the flexible, for they shall not get bent out of shape. Right? I know Jesus said that, just none of the gospel writers wrote it down. But they tend to be flexible. They can move and go as the situation changes. They're adaptive. And pioneers typically disturb the peace. So pioneers typically don't do real well in super institutional settings where there's rigidity and not really an openness to innovation. And so they're hard for more conventional folks to be around. Their presence is threatening. They don't play well with institutionalists. When we're in the clergy gatherings and stuff, we're typically sitting alone or whatever because, oh, there's that crazy person doing that, thing that I question if that's even church, is basically the attitude that people have. And they're usually bicultural, almost always bicultural, meaning they can speak in the language currency of two different cultures. Doesn't necessarily have to be languages entirely, but they can, maybe they were an urban person and they can communicate in a rural setting. Maybe they are somebody who comes from poverty, but they're able to cross the bridge and be with people in a different socioeconomic tier of society, if you will. Maybe they're racially able to move between different groups of people, different kind of cultures, different kind of languages could be a thing that they could do. They can kind of cross those cultural boundaries, and we've looked at how we've tried to think of mission as Christianity crossing into different cultural boundaries, and they're typically able to do that. Pioneers are translators, so they're able to kind of speak to different groups of people and translate the Christian faith between times and cultures and peoples, and learn the language of the people, and learn how to communicate in the semiotics of those people, and then communicate in the gospel across those bridges. They're usually developers. Mature pioneers activate others. So maybe in the beginning, it's about growing fruit on our tree and, look at all my fruits. But as you mature in this gift, it becomes about growing fruit on other people's trees, and almost really not doing the stuff of pioneering yourself, but empowering, activating, and cheerleading others to do this work. And then they're usually prophetic. So meaning they're able to see kind of what's on the horizon. They act on that, and they're dreamers who do. So Gerald Arbuckle, we'll look at him a little bit next week, and he wrote this wonderful book, Refounding the Church, and he calls pioneers the dreamers who do. So there's a difference between a dreamer who has lots of cool ideas and visions and dreams and stuff, and dreamers who do. And typically pioneers can catch a vision for something from God, and then they can kind of carry that out. Just an important thing for those of you who may be thinking about, how do I cultivate these kind of people in my church right now? They learn in mission-shaped apprentice-based processes, and they may struggle with more traditional processes of learning. They like to have a creative voice in the process, and they get frustrated if they don't. They eat their own cooking. So these are practitioners typically, and they form these little networks of practitioners. They're fact finder quick starts. They kind of can just learn from improvisation and failure, and they typically learn by teaching. So when we identified this gift in our system and our churches and our congregations, our denominations and our districts, whatever role of ministry you play, where we need to open places in the system for them to experiment and learn and grow. And theology typically follows the gift. So if you make space for pioneers to do this, and then you shape and form them theologically on the journey, right? The idea of we're going to take you in and we're going to teach you everything you need to know and then release you doesn't really work with pioneers. And they're practitioners of contextual theology, and they don't usually fit into the little nice boxes that we have of liberal, evangelical, conservative, progressive, Catholic theologies. They're able to work across a wide theological breadth typically, and can kind of translate and work in multiple settings like that. And this requires a different form of clergyship. And some of you are already talking about this in the chat and giving feedback on this, that these folks emphasize mission and a diversity and a dialogue and understand an evolution in belief and practice, rather than, putting everything in a box and thinking we have it all figured out. Now, when we think about a priesthood of all believers and unleashing the whole people of God, like what we looked at last week, and really living into that, pioneers are part of that priesthood. And if we think about the gift that Jesus gives in the APEST, where he gives apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers for the building up of Christ, the body of Christ, and the work of ministry, and we can quite easily see, well, there's a diversity of gifts in the church there, right? And people typically function in, high apostle, high prophet, high evangelist, high shepherd, teacher, and then maybe they have like a wing where they're an apostle evangelist or an apostle teacher. So we know that those are gifts, gifted persons that God has given to the church for the building up of the body of Christ. Now, I think we could add into that mix, just like we would talk about apostles have a certain kind of gifting and they have a certain kind of posture in ministry. Prophets, we looked at all these a couple weeks ago. Evangelists, the infectious recruiters, the shepherds, the more pastoral, caregiving kind of chaplain gift, the didaskalos, the teachers who kind of pass down the traditions of faith. I think we could think of pioneering as being in that priesthood of all believers. And through teams, again, the great cloud of witnesses doing this in teams. Typically, if you have these three important roles, the pioneer, the person who's going to do this, the supporters who are going to come alongside, pray, resource, the permission givers, they open the system for change, they unleash this kind of stuff. We looked at this already, but to understand this in the context of a priesthood of all believers, pioneers are part of that great cloud of witnesses and about those pioneering ministries. So they're the people who are passionate about mission on the edges. Supporters are supporting and releasing pioneers. Permission givers who use their role to foster release of pioneers. So I wanted to, we looked at these definitions, but I wanted to give kind of a biblical example for these. So if you think of somebody like Paul the Apostle, obviously a pioneer, right? But Paul did not function in ministry alone. Paul had a team. Like the Gospel of Luke and Acts, parts of Acts, Luke, who's on Paul's team, is writing in the first person, right? Like, we went here and we did this. The Bible talks about the teams that Paul used. He had Junia and Priscilla and Aquila and these people that he equipped and unleashed and worked with in teams. Supporters, so you could think of a biblical example of this would be Barnabas, right? The son of encouragement, who was actually probably the mentor and would like raise up these kind of Paul-like people and equip them and unleash them. And so you have, a biblical idea of the supporter, the Barnabas, the encourager. Then there's the permission giver. So if you think of when Paul is converted and he's blinded by his encounter with Jesus on the road, he goes to Ananias, right? And God says, Ananias, I want you to lay your hands on Paul and heal him and send him as my apostle to the Gentiles. And Ananias is like, God, come on, Saul, like Saul of Tarsus, the guy who's killing Christians. But Ananias obeys God. He lays his hands on Saul. Paul the apostle heals his blindness and sends him, right? So he's that permission giver role, speaking this calling over Paul, healing him and sending him in mission. So there's a biblical precedent for all of this. And this definition from the Church of England, that there are people called by God who are the first to see and creatively respond to the Holy Spirit's initiatives, with those outside the church. They gather around others around them as they seek to establish these new contextual Christian communities. So pulling all that kind of research we looked at together in one big, I know, very verbose, long definition. But then there's the fresh start pioneers. So they're like the edge. You could just kind of drop them out, parachute, drop them. They're the more classic start new things, working from a blank canvas. Folks who like to operate from the edge. There's the mixed economy pioneers, and those are really the ones who use the local church, if you will, as a base of operations for their pioneering. So they're from the center, and if you want to think of entrepreneurs who are kind of on the edge creating new things, and intrapreneurs, those who create new things within systems and find a way to innovate within a system, that would be your mixed economy pioneers there. So to kind of sketch that out a little bit, in all our communities, there are already edge pioneers there, and they're already functioning and operating in our communities, probably doing creative and innovative stuff. And with those edge pioneers, we want to connect with them, join with what they're doing, and learn from them and take that posture. Mixed economy pioneers, they're already sitting in our pews. They're already part of our church. They're already in our congregation, like 80-year-old Larry, who planted a church at 80 in a dog park, right? Maybe they've been there all along, and we didn't realize they had this gift and this calling that if we just supported and unleashed them, they could actually form Christian communities with people who don't go to church. And there's a spectrum to this. There's been more research on pioneers that there's a spectrum of this gift. So there can be those congregational replicators. Like if you give them the keys to how to do this, go get a building, get so many people, knock doors in the neighborhood, pass out flyers, use internet and social media, get people, do a launch, all of that. That's a certain kind of pioneer gift, right? But then there's more moving toward the spectrum. There's like pioneers, they can replicate things. So you'll hear about dinner church and church at play and cafe church. And we read in the Mission Shaped Church report about cell churches and house churches. So if you give them like a model that works and some instructions, they can replicate that across contexts. They can adapt things like a dinner church, for instance, which is a church around a meal and a Jesus story. And they can take that format and they can adapt it into a context. And then there's really kind of moving along the spectrum here, the pioneers that contextualize, and they form more contextual church. Those are the more edgy, start from scratch kind of folks who just can have an idea and have a person apiece and have some communal connections, and they just start something, right? And then there's the incarnational, like we go and we live and we stay. These are like super on the edge. I'm going to just go live with not yet Christians and form community like St. Patrick, out there, learn their language and communicate Christian teaching to them through their own medium. And that could be this new monasticism, the idea of faithful presence, where Jesus is being presenced through us in community with others. And then there's this whole really social justice kind of pioneering, and they activate movements. They're involved in work in racial reconciliation or in some social issue that's going on, anti-racism work. And their gift is really to work in that space and form community around them, around some social organized social enterprise or community organization. So there's that whole spectrum of pioneering. There's a lot of room there. This came from my doctoral research where I looked at different mental models and people and inherited congregations, and these pioneers that were doing this, who I would interview. And I just noticed this really distinct mental model, that they would just be asking totally different questions. So just a couple of these, like in the inherited church, they're going, when are those people you're hanging out with out there going to come to real church, like the Sunday service? And the pioneers asking, how can this become a form of church where these people are and live? Like, my goal is not to get them back, but to create a church that they can connect with, and that Jesus can connect with.